The 90s were a very important time for the video game industry because it was a time of rapid growth. The general public was finally starting to see the appeal in video games, and every company was competing relentlessly against each other in an attempt to ensure they had the most appealing console and games library to offer. Even though competition in the industry still exists today, it doesn't even come close to what it was like in the 90s, due to just how many different companies there were trying to make consoles at that time. Unlike today, where we only have 3 primary competitors left. One of the best ways that companies had discovered to appeal to the public and stay relevant in the competition was to establish a mascot that people could easily recognize. Mario and Sonic had set a blueprint for just how massive a mascot can get, and both of them contributed immensely to establishing the respect values of these companies. Some people liked Mario, some liked Sonic, and this served as a major factor behind their decision of which console to buy. This need of having a recognizable cartoon mascot was not limited to console manufacturers, as individual development studios wanted to be identified easily too. Rare, like many others, was among the race to find the perfect company mascot for themselves. Sure, they had worked on multiple Nintendo projects that were very successful, but the appeal of those characters contributed more towards the respective Nintendo consoles they were on, rather than something Rare could own. After a lot of brainstorming and repurposed projects, Banjo-Kazooie are the characters that Rare decided to stick to. The calm Honey Bear and sassy Breegull duo had a unique personality that was missing from the other mascots at that time, which helped them stand out instantly. And as their names being so close together implies, they are a duo that closely works together as an almost inseparable force, rather than 2 individual characters that you could play as. Of course, the video game in which they were introduced to us in being great certainly worked in their favor, as it helped people feel attached to these characters. Over the years, Banjo-Kazooie has become a dormant IP, and the newer generation of gamers hardly know anything about them. But there's so much more to them than meets the eye, and they deserve to be remembered and recognized for their originality at a time in the industry when 3D platforming was a new concept. So, let's analyze the characters of Banjo and Kazooie today and see what made them work as a duo. The background. The history of Banjo-Kazooie is a very fascinating one. The development of this game originally began in the form of Dream, a fantasy RPG that Rare was working on during the mid-90s. Dream was arguably one of the most ambitious and different games that Rare ever tried to make. And it was about a young boy called Edson who had caused trouble with some pirates and thus had to escape them. Development originally began for the SNES, but once it became obsolete with the Nintendo 64 being out, Rare moved on to the 3D console instead. As the name implies, the game was supposed to be dreamy thanks to its fantasy elements. But once the shift to 3D was made, the developers decided to tone down the fantasy elements to avoid making it appear too childish, and a stronger emphasis on the pirates was placed instead. Sometime during the later phases of development, Rare began to feel that Edson was losing his relevance and did not work as well as a protagonist as they wanted. He was then replaced by a rabbit, and then that rabbit was replaced by a honey bear. The honey bear is, of course, Banjo. And he was already present in the game as a side character made by Rare's co-founder Tim Stamper. So, from being a side character, Banjo became the main character of Dream, but the game was still far from being Banjo-Kazooie. Development went on for a total of 16 months, and it was rebooted at least 4 times as the team struggled to finalize what the game should be like. By the end, they felt like they didn't know how to make fun, and its frame rate struggled on the hardware they had to release it for. Eventually, the team repurposed Dream entirely and ended up making Banjo-Kazooie a game of its own, and its design was now more like what Rare was generally used to making, rather than an ambitious fantasy RPG. Kazooie, on the other hand, was more of an afterthought. The developers toyed with the idea of Banjo's backpack giving him abilities, and eventually, they decided to add wings inside it so that Banjo could use them for traversal and for things like gliding. After some time, they realized the wings could belong to a different character altogether. And finally, Kazooie was conceptualized. Before appearing in Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo had his first official playable appearance in Diddy Kong Racing as a playable character, although he was missing Kazooie by his side. You can catch Banjo's first appearance in our Diddy Kong Racing vs Mario Kart 64 reskin video on screen now. Rare was very impressed by games like Super Mario 64 that were being developed and released around the same time as their own games, so they wanted Banjo to be their go-to mascot. And with Kazooie by his side, they felt that they managed to achieve this feat. And if the sales and popularity of the first game tell us anything, it's that Rare succeeded. Personality traits. Banjo-Kazooie was designed to appeal to gamers of all ages, which can be compared to Disney's animations as they were enjoyed by both children and adults alike. To achieve this, Rare tried to give everything a personality, which means that not only do the characters have unique traits, but even the world that surrounds them does. For example, since Banjo plays an instrument, part of the collectibles in the game are music notes. The second thing that Rare wanted to ensure was the game had humor that stood out. The way to achieve this was to have, quote, very dry, very typically British, slightly sarcastic, happy to poke fun at ourselves humor, as described by Greg Mayles. Every character sort of had something wrong with them, which made them very fun to watch. Looking at Banjo, first of all, yes, his name is literally based on the musical instrument he is known to play in the game. His personality is very straightforward, as he is an easygoing bear that is well-mannered and sweet-natured, to the point that he uses Mr. and Mrs. when speaking to people. He always means well and tries to help people as much as possible, although his overflowing simplicity can sometimes make him appear a bit slow, especially since he tries to say something witty every now and then but fails to be good at it. That's not to say he's the model of kindness, as he does get angry sometimes, and he becomes very aggressive in such cases. But it's not something that happens too often, and usually, when he's not helping people, he's kind of lazy too, as he loves activities like sleeping, resting, and playing poker. And he'd always be much rather doing that over helping people. But his good nature overtakes his laziness, since he does spend a lot of his time exploring the world to stop bad guys. For some reason in the last game, Nuts and Bolts, Banjo is referred to as stupid and crazy by some other characters. But this feels forced, since it's unfair to call him that based on his appearances in the games. Kazooie, on the other hand, is the exact opposite in many ways. She's a wisecracking and somewhat obnoxiously sassy bird that is easily angered and somewhat egotistic. But it might not be fully unprovoked behavior, because everyone that she meets seems to insult her in some way, like Bottles, who called her a strange friend of Banjo. And at another point, Mumbo Jumbo called her the filthy feathered one. So, her hostility and bluntness might be a result of her failure of fitting in, which explains why Banjo is such good friends with her, since he's far kinder than everyone else she comes across. Another distinction that Kazooie has is that she likes adventuring and saving the world. She gets bored by being in one place, which is ironic given that she lives in Banjo's bag. And she also has a more mischievous nature, since she randomly pranks Banjo by sometimes pecking his head just for fun. So in a way, they both complement each other by having such a contrast, given that Banjo is a lazy but polite bear, whereas Kazooie is foul-mouthed and adventurous. Regardless of what kind of personalities they both have though, their friendship is very pure and Kazooie never insults Banjo since she has respect for him, even though she insults everyone else all the time. And Kazooie's foul mouth and hot temper shouldn't be mistaken for representation of her character, as she clearly has a good heart and doesn't mind helping people alongside Banjo, as long as it feels like an adventure to her. That being said, she does cause a lot of trouble because of her bluntness, which Banjo often has to clean up after. And her need for activity often creates disagreements with Banjo, as he prefers a quiet life while she wants to practice offensive moves and go on adventures with him. Relationships. Banjo has very straightforward relationships with the characters in the game. Tootie is his actual sister, and it's clear that he cares for her a lot. The entire plot of the first game is about Banjo embarking on an adventure to rescue his sister, after all. His friendship with Kazooie, as I explained, is very pure, and they both spend a lot of time together. As for other characters in the series, Banjo is kind to everyone besides the villains, and likes helping people out. Kazooie, on the other hand, doesn't get along with most people since they tend to insult her, and even if someone doesn't start it anymore, it has just become her nature by that point. But since she has a good heart, she doesn't shy away from saving the world and helping people alongside Banjo whenever it's needed. She does complain about Banjo wanting to save everyone, but it's also clear that she has a sense of justice, and it can be seen in how much she hates evil like Gruntilda, as she takes pleasure in stopping such people. One interesting thing to note is that she seems to have a soft spot for children. The relationship that we get to see the most throughout the games is that of Banjo and Kazooie, since they stick together. And this is even more prevalent in the gameplay, as the two greatly complement each other. There are things that Banjo does better, and there are things that Kazooie does better, and they both fill in for each other whenever necessary. And Kazooie doesn't mind carrying Banjo around when necessary since she runs faster and can fly around too. Another testament to their closeness is the story of Banjo-Kazooie, Grunty's Revenge, in which the two travel back in time to stop Gruntilda from stopping the duo from ever having met, which shows how much they care about being in each other's lives. So, they both integrate greatly into the world despite their differences with each other and everyone else around them, which is something that you see often in games made by Rare. Motivation. The motivation that Banjo and Kazooie tend to have for their adventures almost always starts off for a personal reason. For example, the first game is about rescuing Tootie. In the second game, the heroes fight off a revenge attempt from Gruntilda's family. And in Grunty's revenge, they must stop Gruntilda from changing their past. However, thanks to Rare's open world and immersive fantasy design, the stories always include interacting with and helping out tons of other people on the journey. Banjo's kindness and Kazooie's sense of adventure and justice combine to have a larger motivation than just self-serving tasks, so they are most certainly heroes. As for the side characters in this series, they tend to have their own goals, but some of them do want to help the heroes too, like Gruntilda's friendly sister in the first game. The evil characters just want the usual things, like dominance, revenge, and in Gruntilda's case, Tootie's beauty. Yes, I'm sure that rhymes on purpose. In Nuts and Bolts, the duo competes in a contest organized by the Lord of Games to make sure the ownership of Spiral Mountain does not go over to Gruntilda. So, even though this one still affects them, they could just skip town instead. But Banjo and Kazooie are the farthest thing from selfish, so they compete for the good of the entire town. Character arc and development. Banjo's life before meeting Kazooie was very static. He lived a quiet and lazy life with his sister, Tootie. And the only time he did something noticeable was when he agreed to help Diddy Kong in 1997 by heading over to Timber Island. He didn't feel that racing was his calling, however, and came back to his boring life. After meeting Kazooie, his life finally became adventurous when his sister got kidnapped. And after he defeated Gruntilda, just 2 months later he had to stop Grunty from changing the past. And then just 2 years later, Gruntilda's family came into play and forced Banjo on yet another adventure, after which he was finally safe for years. Then, for around 8 years, Kazooie's wishes of still being active or going on an adventure were ignored by Banjo, and he became temporarily obese while his life's purpose was reduced to playing video games, eating pizza, and sleeping. Not much is known about Kazooie's past, except that she was found in a backup by Banjo and became friends. She, alongside Tootie, kept trying to convince Banjo to go on an adventure, but it never worked due to his lazy nature, until circumstances forced him to comply. And up to the events of Nuts and Bolts, she was forced to live a lazy life with Banjo because he just refused to do anything else. So, after defeating Gruntilda for the 3rd time, they just had to wait until the Lord of Games came into play and finally forced Banjo to get out. After the two of them stopped evil once again, they seemed to live less of a boring life, since Banjo and Kazooie joined a racing tournament in 2010 alongside Sonic and his friends. And then they appeared in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, entering a fighting tournament. Since the stories of these games aren't very detailed, there wasn't much development to be seen within the characters. Banjo and Kazooie start off as fully fleshed out characters in terms of their personalities, motivations, and relationships with other characters. And the only thing that seems to change over the years is that in Nuts and Bolts, Kazooie seems to have rubbed off on Banjo a little, since he finally uses insults and sarcasm occasionally, although still very much less compared to Kazooie. Banjo-Kazooie's impact. From the moment Banjo showed up in Diddy Kong Racing, even before he had his own game, it was clear he was meant to be a major Rare icon. Once the first game was released, it sold up to 3 million copies, which made it one of the best-selling N64 games. And not only that, but it's also considered one of the best games ever made in the genre, as it received rave reviews from critics and gamers alike. Then came Banjo-Tooie, which was considered an improvement over the first game in almost every single way, although some believed it felt less original compared to its first game in terms of innovation. Regardless, the game looked amazing on the Nintendo 64, and featured great drawing distance, real-time shadows, and rich textures within the environment. By the end of its sales cycle, the game sold roughly 1.5 million units, which is half as much as the first game, but still decent sales for the N64. Then we had 2 spin-offs, the first of which is the GBA Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, and the second one is Banjo Pilot. Interestingly, Banjo Pilot was originally going to be a Diddy Kong Racing video game, but due to Rare's buyout by Microsoft, they lost the rights to use that character as its own by Nintendo. Thus, it was repurposed into a Banjo-Kazooie game without a story. Both Banjo Pilot and Grunty's Revenge received mixed reviews, as reviewers found them to be good games with several faults, like their length, lack of difficulty, and so on. Finally, we have Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which is their final video game together, and Rare tried to reinvent the series, making this one more vehicle-focused. While you still get out of the vehicles, its main focus was on building things and then driving them, and melee combat was reduced compared to the first 2 entries. The game received good reviews and people appreciate the game even more in retrospective, as some of its gameplay and building mechanics were ahead of their time. However, Nuts and Bolts was considered a commercial failure, and the franchise has been dormant since. Regardless, its influence can still be seen, as Banjo and Kazooie appear as playable characters in Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Additionally, Banjo and Kazooie have had cameos in many games, like Grab by the Ghoulies, Viva Pinata and its sequel, the Conquer series, and Minecraft. They've been referenced by developers, gamers, and critics a lot over the years, as the Banjo franchise is an unforgettable part of the 90s 3D platformer surge. And even if we never see this duo in their own video games again, they will always have a special place in our hearts. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below about Banjo-Kazooie. Would you like to see them back? Do you have any great memories of them? Or do you think they're overrated? If you'd like to see similar videos from me, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and hit the bell icon for instant notifications.